Welcome back to the All Turtles podcast, a show about the future of work, the future of health, and entrepreneurs building the future. I'm John C. Fuentes, co-founder of All Turtles. Today, I'm interviewing Maryanne Wolf. She's the author of Reader Come Home and an advocate for literacy and deep reading. Maryanne has some practical advice for how to foster critical thinking skills, even when our information intake is more reliant on technology now than ever. So we're joined today by Maryanne Wolf, and Maryanne is the author of Reader Come Home, and she's also the director of the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at UCLA. Maryanne, thanks so much for joining us.
A true pleasure, especially this moment in time, John.
I'll say. Before we go too much, I think in your newest book, could we just have a couple questions on your background? You have this doctorate from Harvard in human development and psychology, and we're just curious what sparked your interest in, what is it, cognitive neuroscience and linguistics?
Yes.
And what are these topics that you're interested in?
So I'm actually a person who has 2 degrees in English literature and thought I was going to be studying the poet Rilke for the rest of my life in a university setting. So it was a very odd turn of events in which I spent a Peace Corps-like year in a rural area in Hawaii, which was very remote, lost its school, lost its teachers. And a group of us from the mainland went and became, if you will, resident Peace Corps-like teachers. And my area was literacy, assuming that all my knowledge about English literature would help me teach children to read was one of the greatest mistakes I've ever made in my life. But by the time the year was over, it gave me a profound understanding of how essential literacy is for the species and for the development of the potential, the intellectual, social, and even moral potential of our young. And so at that point, I said, I will study literature at night. It will be my avocation. But during the day, I am going to study the science of words. And so actually, all of my books are about the science of the reading brain in one way or another. The new one, Reader Come Home, is the reading brain in a digital world. So I am interested in how that body of knowledge can inform the development of literacy in our species and to help people understand that what I call literacy is really the product of a very sophisticated circuitry in the brain that propels not just getting information, but at its best, propulses our capacity for critical analysis, inference, and very importantly, empathy, perspectives of others. So for me, there is a direct relationship between science and democracy in this study of the reading brain.
Wow. All right, there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
And as someone with a copy of Letters to a Young Poet on his nightstand for the better part of 15 plus years, I appreciate the work that you're doing.
John, you just for you, and maybe your listener, the original title of my book was to be Letters to the Good Reader, based on Rilke, and not just on the fact that he was this extraordinary lyrical user of language, but because, as you know, that book that I wrote is an epistolary book, which is unusual in science. But it was meant to be letters to all of us today who are tackling problems that are very complex. And so my hope was that it could be called Letters to the Good Reader to honor Rilke's use of the letter to give information that was unfolding and evolving in a gentle way to readers who he would never know. And in my case, of course, I rarely get to know who my readers are, but my hope is that we enter a dialogue about these questions in society with regard to technology and literacy and democracy.
Wow. Now, we actually heard about you through the podcast. A podcast listener wrote in and talked about your work after he read Reader Come Home. And so for those who might not be as familiar, can you just talk a little bit more about some of these themes in
Sure.
readership or decline of, and maybe what you're worried about?
Well, for me, literacy is a basic human right. And that means that every child, every human, no matter what age, no matter what culture, has, I hope, an opportunity in their environment to become fully literate. Full literacy is something that is not understood in this country or elsewhere. It's taken for granted. The reality is that only 1/3 of our children in fourth grade and eighth grade, and we know this from the national report cards, that's called the National Assessment for Educational Progress, that only 1/3 of them are reaching levels of proficiency that allow full literacy. And by that, I mean something that, back to a very basic, if you will, neuroscience 001 in this area. The brain wasn't meant to read, John. It was meant to do all these wonderful things, but it never was meant to read. And so what the brain has to do with a novel cultural invention is to create a new circuit. Well, that circuit can be very basic, which is what children have. It helps them decode information and they're learning through it. But then something semi-miraculous happens. As we read more and more, the circuit gets more and more elaborated and connected to very sophisticated cognitive, linguistic, and even affective and motoric processes. So by the time you become an expert reader, you are fast enough, that is, proficient enough to connect basic information to very unbasic, very sophisticated processes of putting together what you know, your background knowledge, with the information in the text and draw inferences from it. Evaluate the truth or the lack of truth in it. Draw interesting, if you will, deductions like a Sherlock Holmes from the information you've given to build a bigger picture. All of that allows us to be critically analytic in our reading, which generalizes to how we think in general. The second major process that gets added is an affective one, so that by the time we become this expert reader and can develop these, what I call deep reading processes, we can take on the perspective of others, which is a really no small feat cognitively and affectively. We can hold our own perspective, but then look at something that is sometimes even contradicting our perspective. But whatever it is, it allows us to enter, to pass over into the thoughts and feelings of the other author. Now, Proust said this beautifully. He said, reading is that fertile miracle of communication that takes place while we're alone in a chair, basically. And that's really what the empathic aspect, the perspective taking dimension of deep reading allows us. Now, that is not happening, going back to what I said, for people who aren't proficient. So when I say that only 1/3 of our young are proficient readers, according to these national report cards, we are in trouble. We have to ensure that our citizenry have a level of critical analysis and empathy so that the democracy, which has to be a place of multiple voices, can be really seriously understood. Because if you are not proficient, if you are simply getting the information, and in a culture, in a digital culture in which we're bombarded with information, now here's where it gets tricky. Paradoxically, with all that information, we end up going to the silos we're most familiar with, which reinforces what we knew before, but doesn't invite the challenge, the perspective of others. So we reinforce this familiar silo of information, and that allows us to be comfortable, but it also allows us to be manipulable, to be vulnerable to, within that silo, fake news, false information. So we're really talking about some very tricky things that are happening about a process that most people take totally for granted and don't realize that the very reading brain they believe they possess has changed and will continue to change with different mediums.
Wow. There's so much to unpack here. At first, I was thinking through just who determines reading proficiency. Are the measurement tools still accurate?
Oh, these are very accurate. We've got a host of measures of how well a person comprehends what they read. And the National Assessment for Educational Progress or Educational Performance has been doing these, they call them the national grade cards for literacy and math over the last years. And what you're seeing is that we're not getting better, we're plateauing or getting worse. And much worse than the very fact that there's only 1/3 of our children reaching these levels is that there are distinct chasms between some of our children who are underprivileged. So if you look at Atlanta, where I'm going to be doing a town hall this week, and we looked at the data on the African American kids and the Caucasian kids in the Atlanta Speech School. So there you have a large percentage of your Caucasian kids who are proficient. You have about 16 to 17% of your African American kids who are reaching proficient levels. LA is not as bad, but it is, again, you have these chasms of factors that are related as often as not to whether you are in a privileged neighborhood with a privileged school versus an underprivileged one.
Now, I suspect the answer to my next question is no, but I want to ask it anyway. And is there similar instrumentation for determining empathy in children?
There are studies of empathy. And I would say, well, we're getting better, but by and large, we're not there yet. I have a wonderful colleague in Israel, Tommy Katzir, who's really performing, I think, if you will, some of the best studies of how we can increase the social emotional IQ of kids, if you will, in a program called Islands of Empathy, I believe is the name of her program. But she's studying it. There are people like Conrath. I can't remember. I think it was at Stanford that she ran this study. But it was a questionnaire, and the questionnaire studies are important, but we need to do more and more on this than we do. But here's the, if you will, unfortunate reality. At least in one of those studies by Conrath, what you see is a decline over the last 15 years in empathy, not an increase. So you would think with connectivity around our world and the connectivity that links us, we would see a rise in empathy. But if her study is replicated, we're seeing a decline. Now, there are other forms of the study of empathy. For example, in Germany, you have the work of Tanya Singer at the Max Planck Institute formerly, and she has been doing this interesting work in the past where they show that empathy, these are brain imaging studies, that empathy actually is involving not just affective but cognitive aspects, so that our theory of mind, our theory of what other persons are thinking is involved. Those same regions that are involved in theory of mind are involved in empathy as well as areas of quote unquote compassion. So yes, there are studies of this, but are we there in as much as, my confidence in studies of reading or measures of reading is far greater.
Right. And that's what you may be able to suss out. I'm trying to connect if there's any kind of causal or scientific way we can look at deep readers as being more empathetic people?
This is an area that I'm tremendously interested in, both as someone in cognitive neuroscience, but also someone who is still always at nighttime a student of literature. And I'll quote you something not from neuroscience, but actually from literature. Jane Smiley, the novelist, was asked whether the novel was going to die and reading itself. And she says, oh, no, the novel will not die. But the problem is it will be sidelined. And if it is sidelined, the very aspect that is so important in the novel, that is the empathy, people will not. And she said this was several years ago, but I think it's prophetic and prescient. There will be those leaders who do not read, who will never have encountered the thoughts and feelings of others that would lead them to become empathic people. So I think, without making a political statement, but rather a cognitive and affective one, I believe that, I don't know whether it was Jim Mattis who said this, but the generals who were surrounded by books had less casualties than the generals who did not have books around them. I think the same thing can be said about all our leaders. The more that we read, the more likely we are to understand the thoughts and feelings of others. That is an aspect of reading that is in peril, I believe, when we have people who are non-readers or basic decoders of information and not true processors.
Right. Being more task-oriented instead of thinking critically on a topic and putting aside your emotions and doing some long-term planning. And that all makes a lot of sense to me. Now, are there any positives to whatever the opposite of deep reading is, skim reading?
Of course. And here's where it's important to make a very clear statement. I work hard to develop a work that will be on what I call the biliterate reading brain, in which children understand the purpose for what they're reading. The last thing you and I, John, and any listener needs is to feel that we have to use deep reading on our email or on all the sources of information that we have to quickly digest and filter. So with the bombardment of information, skimming is a defense mechanism that is a good one. The problem is that there's this overused maxim in psychology, use it or lose it. Well, your reading circuit for deep reading, if you are constantly skimming, you are not using your deep reading processes. And the less you use them, the less they are strengthened, the less likely they will come automatically online, so to speak, when you're reading. The more likely that the dominant mode, the skim mode, this is more like William James, the habit of digital reading, the habit of skimming and word spotting, will bleed over to other things you read, leading to a less immersive form of reading, which is a common complaint among many people today, that they don't feel they have that.
It's boring.
They're not entering it in the same way.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Now, let's put this in context of now where we're having to maintain, social distance and do a lot of our human interaction and maybe therefore critical thinking with some digital product as facilitating that.
I would state it even more strongly. This moment has tethered us to the digital mode of receiving and producing information. And there are consequences we don't know. So my job, self-appointed, is to really work with those people. Like right now, I'm working with a Canadian group who is trying to do research that is desperately needed on what are the best ways of using digital devices for teaching. To find the best, you have to look at the positive and the negative. And so I use the work in my book. Very few people, I think, have a clue who he is. But the philosopher, the 15th century philosopher Nicholas of Cusa said that when you are faced with two contradicting truths, you need to take a stance of learned ignorance and ask, what do we know? What do we don't know? And so that's what I'm trying to do in my work. What do we know? What do we don't know? And what the things we know are that there are huge studies by the Europeans, especially, and the Israelis, but especially what's called the e-read network in Europe. And Mangan is one. Naomi Barron from American University is one here. Tommy Katsir, Marie Barzilai. There's so many good people who are involved. But the biggest study they've done was done in Barcelona by the Salmon's group, and they studied over 171,000 subjects, in a meta-analysis of 50 studies from 2000 on one single task. What is your comprehension if you read the same story in text, paper, versus the screen? And over 171 subjects. These are, older, that is college age, not adults necessarily, but certainly not children. And what they find out is that their comprehension is better with print. Now, the real question is, well, what if this was from year 2000 till 2000, end of 2017? What about the digital natives in the last years of that meta-analysis? So they did a sub-analysis. John, I'm going to ask you, what's your intuition for those who we would consider more or less digital readers? What do you think they do better on?
I imagine the digital platforms and on the skim reading.
And you'd be wrong. And I would have been wrong because that was my hypothesis as well. And the reality is that they were even better on print, statistically. And the reason is because they were skimming. And when you ask them their perception, they believe they're better digitally because they say, well, we're faster. That's right. But as the LA journalist David Ulin said, we must not assume that speed is equivalent to illumination. And that's the problem. Speed is not the same as understanding. Some things, depending on the purpose, are better when you read faster. But by and large, if you short circuit the text and your own reading brain by skimming and word spotting, things go missing. And we have to understand that better. We have to understand how to get deep reading on the digital medium. And we have to understand that half of the battle is deciding what we ourselves are better at for which types of reading, for what purpose that we're reading. So there's no binary here. This is why I use Nicholas of Cusa. We have a lot more to know than we do now. It's not going to be, and I work with people and have been working with people on digital devices for non-literate children in Africa and India, initiative called Curious Learning in Boston. There's no reason to interpret me as a Luddite. You can, but you would be making the same mistake that I would make if I would say, read everything in text or read everything digitally. It's not a simple world. It's not a simple question, but we, by our research and by our own personal awareness, can help read at a deeper level, which will only ultimately be better for society.
Can I ask if you have or use a Kindle?
Of course. Every plane trip. But then you ask me, well, what's in your briefcase? If it's a book that I need to really think about, that's in the briefcase or printed out. If it's something that I am just, can skim through on one plane ride, I can't go on my planes right now. But of course, there's, this is not, I'm not binary. The world's not binary. The world shouldn't be binary.
Now, as an advocate for children's literacy in particular, do you have any recommendations for parents or educators or, parents slash educators right now who
Yeah,
can...
I'm working on an essay, and it's a very difficult one because on the one hand, we are faced with a regression that's so big, especially for children that I'm most interested in, the struggling readers, for whatever reason they are struggling with this dyslexia or environmental or whatever. So we need, and I've been working with Haskins Lab, Yale's Haskins Lab. And in fact, I'd love your audience to know that we've made a literacy organizer so that from infancy through adolescence, you can look up this, what we call resource library. It's Haskins Global Resource Library. If you look that up, you will see all these online free activities that match the skills from infancy through adolescence on reading. So our first iteration was launched 10 days ago. But for parents, I have two recommendations. Make sure your children are keeping some kind of practice of the skills that are developmentally where they are, and those online activities will be very helpful. Simultaneously, read to your child from books. Help them have, if possible, I know a lot of our libraries are closed, but help them appreciate your appreciation, your love of literature and science and just the relationship that comes from you reading to your child and having your child read to you or read to a dog or read to a peer, a child. These are very important to keep alive. So it's both practice of the skills, whatever level they are, and some of these activities, all the activities that are on that Haskins organizer are high quality, usually evidence-based, and curated by a group of reading scholars across the country. So make sure you are using activities that are high quality and, if possible, curated. But second, use books, use reading, engage, so it's the science and the poetry is what we need to keep alive and well with our children right now.
That's such a good message. And that's something that I took, from my time with the book, is that it's very cautionary, but also, your work is very hopeful.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm hopeful. Even in the midst of all this, I am hopeful. There's so many good people who are working so hard. And we have problems. We have challenges like never before and the regressions like never before. But together, we're going to make up for it.
I'm with you, Maryanne. So where can our listeners learn more about your work and get a copy of the book?
The copy of the book, I really encourage you to use your local bookstore. Even though I'm in LA, I still use my Harvard bookstore. They send it out just almost as fast as other places do. So I'm always supporting local bookstores wherever I can. And if you can't, then of course everyone else knows where you could get those books. The other thing that I would say is I do have a web page, but I also would truly encourage people to look up this Haskins Global Resource Library for activities that we'll keep making new iterations of that over time.
That's great. And we'll make sure to put that in the show notes.
Great.
Well, Maryanne, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate the conversation.
Absolutely.
This podcast is a production of the All Turtles Worldwide Media Empire. We recorded this episode at the noisy Union Street Studio in San Francisco, California. Thanks to Maryanne for joining us this episode. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, send us an email to hello@all-turtles.com. Marie reads every message. Thanks to everyone who made this episode possible, including Jim Metzendorf for editing, Marie McCoy-Thompson for producing, Chris Plug for his audio expertise, Micah Rivera for our artwork, and Matt Ammerman for our theme music. On behalf of Jessica Collier, Phil Libin, yours truly, John Cifuentes, and the rest of the All Turtles team, thanks for listening.